I'm so glad to have Jim Sciutto with me. He is a CNN anchor, chief national security analyst over at the network. He has a book out now in its third printing, The Return of the Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War. Jim, provocative title.
First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I've been looking forward to talking to you. I've been covering this relationship for a long time, U.S., Russia, China, but also just the changing security situation in the world. And it's been on a consistent downward path, right? It doesn't have to end at open conflict between the powers, but the trend lines are not good. And listen, we already have one major conflict, thankfully to date, a proxy conflict, right, in Ukraine, largest war in Europe since World War II. And I wrote this book in part because I think folks need to be thinking about this, right? Maybe to a greater degree than they imagined or want to, but it has the potential. It's already changing our lives, and it has the potential to change our lives in some pretty dramatic ways.
Yeah, you get into the book. You take us inside the U.S. government as they started to realize that Putin was putting an unprecedented number of troops on the Ukrainian border. And for a number of us who've grown up in the post-Cold War era, the idea that there's a land invasion in Europe by Russian forces caused some folks there to do a double take. Like, are we actually seeing what we're seeing right now?
Listen, I got, and I relate this in the book, I got my first warning about this in November 2021 when one of my best military sources, I was checking in with him just on a whole bunch of stuff. And he said, listen, sit down, you got to direct your attention towards Ukraine. And I'd been to Ukraine going back to 2014 and covered the initial stages of the first invasion and all the consequences of that. But he said, Russia is amassing an invasion force and they're going to invade. And I remember my first conversations with my colleagues, including my boss here. I called my boss at CNN and I said, we got to watch this closely. We may be, about to cover a war in Europe. The initial reaction was skeptical, right? And that continued right up to the day before the invasion.
And so this was a year out. I mean, when you're talking March 2021, that's almost 1 year out from the invasion.
November 21, I should say. So five months out. And they were seeing it, right? I mean, remember they even began to declassify some of these satellite photos that showed the forces amassed around there. But the skepticism was real, and it certainly wasn't confined to folks in the news business. I mean, you heard this from politicians. You heard it from European officials. You heard it even from Vladimir Zelensky, in the weeks leading up to the war, saying, hey, guys, all this talk about war is killing our economy, that sort of thing. But
right, the Ukrainians were skeptical. Yep. They're like, you Americans, like, you're going a little too far here saying Putin's going to invade.
Yep. And listen, a lot of folks raised to me, and this is understandable, including folks in my company, they're like, well, you guys got, you guys meaning U.S. intelligence world got Iraq WMD wrong. How do you know this time? Which is, listen, the legacy of bad intel calls continues, and understandably so. But what I told him then is that this is fundamentally different because it's not just hearing from some guy what they might be doing. They could see the forces wrapped around Ukraine, and it wasn't 10% of Russia's conventional force or 50%. It was the bulk of Russia's conventional force, ground forces, air defenses, you name it, ready to go in. Plus, they had intercepted communications of commanders talking about the preparations for war. But the disbelief continued. And what's interesting about that disbelief is it continues to this day, right? I mean, obviously, Russia went ahead and invaded Ukraine. But when you talk about Putin's other ambitions, things that he said quite publicly, folks will still say, that's just bluster. And I was like, you said that was bluster before he, tried to bulldoze Ukraine, absorb Ukraine. And, there's a pattern with him and also with Xi Jinping that they tend to say what they're going to do before they do it.
Right. I often will get those questions from people when Putin blusters about his nuclear arsenal as well. That in human history, only 2 atom bombs have been dropped, both by the U.S., thankfully. That's it. And so, my sense is that when, Putin's talking about, my nuclear forces, et cetera, that's just bluster. But is there a reason to take him more seriously these days based on what we've seen unfold in Ukraine?
100%. I got a whole chapter in the book about how close Putin came, in the belief of U.S. and Western intelligence services, to using a nuke in Ukraine in late 2022, so a few months after the invasion, to the point where the U.S. was preparing rigorously for this very eventuality and reaching out for help around the world to try to prevent it, including help from non-traditional partners, China and Russia, to help bring Putin back from the brink. But it was the U.S. read at the time, partly based on Russian public threats, but also based on communications, once again, among Russian commanders and just the circumstances. Because what was happening then was Russia was getting pushed back. And in Kherson in the south, there was a danger of many thousands of Russian forces being surrounded. And the difference between Russia and the U.S. is that the use of nuclear weapons, particularly tactical nuclear weapons, is much lower on their escalation ladder than it is for us. So their doctrine includes using nukes in response to conventional threats to the Russian state. And the read from the U.S. was, all those circumstances are here, they might actually do it. And if you look back, the U.S. wasn't on an island here, right? Because you had quite public statements from Indian leaders and Chinese leaders saying, no, we do not want nuclear war. And that, the circumstances that created that situation could return again. So, I wouldn't look at the nuclear threats as entirely bluster. I mean, he does bluster about them, but not all the time.
And how key were the Chinese, the Indians, and others to putting out that fire, putting out that potential?
Key, according to, I spoke to several senior U.S. officials who were directly involved, and they give a lot of credit. They give a lot of credit to India and China for helping pull Putin back from the brink, because the calculation in part was, Putin may not listen to us, but he might listen to India and China to back him off. And it's actually interesting in the midst of what is at times sobering read. Sadly, that's the reality we're presented with. That moment and that cooperation in that moment provides some hope that you can work with your adversaries when you have a shared interest. In this case, a shared interest in preventing a nuclear exchange, or at least a nuclear attack in Europe. It's not clear that. In fact, I was told the U.S. did not have plans to respond with a nuclear attack, but they certainly would have responded, and who knows where that all leads.
Yeah, it's important here as we think about this. The U.S. has been trying to be very strategic here and how they've approached the war in Ukraine, aiding Ukraine, what weapons they give Ukraine, what permissions they give Ukraine. And we find ourselves now 2.5 years in as we tape this, Jim, into this war. And I was at the NATO summit in Washington this month. And when you ask top officials there, when does this end? How does this end? They say, listen, it's up to Zelensky. We're not going to push him one way or another. And it's an open check, an open war in effectively perpetuity here until Putin or Zelensky make a decision otherwise.
Yeah. It's interesting. Being at the summit too, and I talk about this a bit in the book, is that if you have private conversations with NATO officials who are very pro-Ukraine, right? They want Russia to lose here. They want Ukraine to survive as a viable, sovereign, peaceful state and as potentially a NATO partner way down the line, right? But privately, they will concede that it's hard to see the circumstances where Ukraine gets back all of its territory, right? Particularly Crimea, which Russia views as a strategic asset,
Right. Crimea, Russia's been in since 2014. And then add to that the land they've taken the past 2.5 years. The number that's thrown around is about 20% of Ukraine right now is occupied by Russia.
Yeah. And folks will say, and I'm betting they said privately to you, that at some point there's going to be a territorial concession, right? The trouble with that is, one, Ukraine understandably doesn't love the idea of slicing off part of its sovereign territory. Someone made a great and powerful point to me, months ago about political pressures inside Ukraine. In the midst of the Ukraine aid debate here in the U.S., folks talked about, well, there are voters who are bored with the war, the financial costs, etc. Zelensky's political pressure, someone described to me, is tens of thousands of Ukrainian mothers who lost their sons and daughters, right? Mm-hmm. That's a powerful political force telling them, yes, they fought and died, but I got to give up some of our country. He may get to that point. They may have to get to that point, but that's a big hurdle to get over. The other one is that no one trusts any deal that you make with Vladimir Putin. They just don't, because he breaks them all the time, right? I mean, the various Minsk agreements that were meant to end the war prior to 2022 bulldozed through that, but even going back to the Budapest memorandum, which by which Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, security guarantees from Russia, etc. Of course, that didn't stand up either. So if you're a Ukrainian, you're like, okay, I could go to the negotiating table, but who's on the other side?
Mhm.
I mean, I suppose the way you get around that is you have security guarantees that are somehow satisfying to the Ukrainian side. But man, it's a volatile mix. You don't want to be the guy. You don't want to be the Ukrainian leader trying to sell that, to the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, especially being this wartime leader, saying we're going to get back every inch of territory that we were invaded illegally by this country, and yeah, we can make a concession to Putin, and then tomorrow he decides to invade and take more of what he believes is his. And so, is there any sense, though, privately, what officials tell you is the potential timeline here? How much longer can this go on? Because we're coming off of there was the much vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive that didn't get much land back, and they're sitting there along this 500-600 mile battle line where they're trading inches, feet on a daily basis. How much longer can this go on? I mean, and is part of it revolving around the U.S. election of potential President Trump and what that means?
Listen, yes, short answer to that question. I mean, and you look at, yes, the Ukrainian counteroffensive did not break through as many as had hoped, but this Russian offensive in the Northeast more recently has not broken through either, right? And at enormous Russian losses. I mean, if you look at the UK estimates, Russia's losing tens of thousands over the span of just a few weeks. So in the span of a few weeks, losing multiples of what Russia lost in the Afghanistan war back in the 80s that helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? They're enduring enormous losses, which, it's endured to this point. Is that forever? So certainly the election, nothing happens before the election, because Putin is hoping that he gets a more amenable character in the Oval Office that's willing to make a deal with him that's to his advantage, and that's Trump.
So the feeling from Putin is Trump comes in there and is going to tell Zelensky, listen, give Putin a piece of land here.
Right. And listen, Trump has said, as you know, publicly, he could solve the war in a day. The read of that is that it would involve land concessions. And the Ukrainians and many NATO officials I speak with, the reason they fear Trump's view of this for a number of reasons. One, Trump has often taken the side of Vladimir Putin. Go to Helsinki, interference in the 2016 election. He praises Putin repeatedly. Two, Trump has done the opposite as it relates to NATO, right? He's expressed skepticism. I recount in the book how Trump's former senior advisors say he very nearly pulled the U.S. out of NATO in 2018. They say quite explicitly in the book that if he's reelected, he will take the U.S. out of NATO, or at least attempt to, or at least neuter it as a credible bulwark against Russia.
Congress passed a law that said we can't leave NATO, right?
They did. So on paper, that helps. The truth is, though, the commander-in-chief has enormous power to enforce, Article 5 of NATO, which is you will come to the defense of a NATO ally attacked by Russia. There are a lot of folks in Eastern Europe who doubt that Trump would honor that. Now, he might. I speak to Republican lawmakers who say, listen, Trump doesn't want to be seen as weak. He would absolutely honor that. But in the book, I speak to folks who serve Trump at the highest level, and they say, don't count on it, right? So that's another dynamic in this as to where not only where does Donald Trump view Ukraine and how he views Ukraine, but how he views the whole defense of Europe, right? And what the U.S. role is in the defense of Europe.
So there's a lot of uncertainty come January 20th next year if he's elected.
100%. And I've got a whole chapter in the book about how he and Biden just have fundamentally different views of the world. And again, it's not me talking and pontificating here. It's folks who serve Trump at the highest level, John Kelly, John Bolton, Mark Milley, who say he just doesn't have a commitment to or interest in these mutual defense agreements that we have, and not just in Europe. I mean, they talk about South Korea, they talk about Japan. And remember, there's a track record here from his first administration. His last act as commander in chief was to reduce U.S. forces in Germany, right? Wasn't acted on because it took a long time to do it. He stopped U.S. joint military exercises with South Korea. He has questioned why the U.S. has to do that. And that would have enormous follow-on consequences when you think about it, because if the U.S. does pull out, and let's say, yes, Congress has passed legislation that would prevent him from just saying, we're out of NATO, fine. But if he makes that commitment untrustworthy, then those countries have to make their own decisions for their own defense. And at the NATO summit, every European official I met with, I would ask the question, what do you do if Trump is elected and he backs off of NATO? And, the standard response is, I'm not going to comment on elections. We respect the outcome. I said, listen, but here's the question I'm asking you is not to comment on our elections. I'm asking if you have a plan B for your nation's own security, if you can't rely on the U.S. to come to your defense. And they need plan Bs. And sadly, a piece of that is the possibility of going nuclear, right? Because if you're South Korea or Japan and you can't rely on the U.S., what is your response to having a nuclear power right next door to you? You could very credibly make a decision to go nuclear. Yeah. I mean, there's open talk in Europe of which European nations go nuclear if the U.S. pulls back from a credible defense commitment to Europe. I mean, they're talking about it already because they have to.
So interestingly, the impact of the U.S. pulling out of these defense accords and doing our own thing is a world where many more nation states have to take up nuclear weapons because they've depended on the U.S. shield of sorts for the past few decades.
This is the myth of if we pull out, everything will be fine. And this has become an essential Trumpian and Republican argument, right? Is that let those countries deal with themselves. Okay, you can do that. Fine, but you have to look at the follow-on consequences and what that means for our own security as well. Is it safer to double the number of nuclear powers, right, in the span of a year? And by the way, I mean, you look at the Middle East with Iran quite close to a nuclear weapon. What are Saudi Arabia's calculations in response to that? UAE, these countries might make their own decision. So would Israel make a decision to go public with its nuclear arsenal?
I was going to say, you could go back to the early 70s and, Israel was on the verge without getting the aid from Nixon and Kissinger during the 73 Yom Kippur War. The talk is that they pulled out their nukes so American satellites could see them saying, hey, we're going to use these if you don't give us weapons.
Yep. It's a great point. And, I try to, throughout the book and when I've been talking about the book, is make the case to the American people why this is not some distant challenge for them, the change in the world order, right? That we, whatever you think of the costs, and there are real costs to this, both financial and U.S. troops, at risk, there are benefits to it that we like. You own a business, it's a multinational, or you work for a business, the ability to open up offices in Eastern Europe or Asia or China already, that's already a diminishing, right, land of opportunity in that sense. Having a rules-based international order gives you that opportunity. You could send your kids to study abroad in places that when I was a kid you couldn't do, Eastern Europe and China, although that's also becoming less likely because of the rules-based international order. You can rely on your commercial pilot's ability to land at airports in Europe using GPS because of the rules-based international order, which is already something that's being challenged because Russia has been deploying these GPS jammers there, and we're seeing that in Asia now. That impacts us in ways that we don't realize, right? And that having a kind of Wild West in great power relations begins to threaten and diminish those things. Add on top of that a lot of the technologies that Russia and China have in cyber and in terms of weaponization of space, they can impact you and me today, right now, where we're sitting today.
Yeah, I was struck by something Secretary Blinken told us earlier this month when we were at NATO, where he's like, isolationism may sound good in theory, but if you look at world history, has never benefited us as a nation. in the lead up to World War II. And while it's been 80 years now, nearly, Jim, since World War II, where the U.S. effectively has become the police officer of the world,
Mhm.
and 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 I don't know, if do we mark the Afghan withdrawal as sort of the end
Mm.
of that? Was that a key demarcation point? I mean, obviously, we still have assets deployed abroad. We're assisting in
Mhm.
Ukraine, etc. But there was, I mean, do you see that as sort of a moment here for the U.S. time dealing with the globe?
I would say definitely a moment. I wouldn't say the end, because what followed was, as you say, a joint defense of Ukraine, right? Not with boots on the ground, but with a concerted military effort, the expansion of NATO, right? As we're at NATO last week, you're welcoming Sweden in. So two countries joining, and a solidification of some of these defense agreements in Asia and so on. So not the end, but a perhaps an inflection point, right? And there are some who say, and I think that this is a credible argument, that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan further emboldened Vladimir Putin, might have been part of his calculus that, well, if they're pulling out of there, they're not going to worry about me invading Ukraine, right? Now, that was a miscalculation on his part, but is it conceivable that factored into his calculus? I absolutely believe so. And I will say this, and I talk a lot about this in the book because I spend a
Right.
good amount of
The
time
invasion of
on
Ukraine
Taiwan.
happens almost exactly 6 months after our withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the ongoing threat to Taiwan, there's not a single person I spoke to for this book, whether in Europe or in Asia, went out to Taiwan to research, or really anywhere, who doesn't draw a direct connection between events in Ukraine and the threat to Taiwan. That China is watching how the world reacts to Ukraine, and for how long, right? Do we run out of interest in Ukraine? Do we get exhausted by it and say, "Oh, it's too expensive. It's taking too much time. Wars are boring. I don't want to talk about that war anymore." As it calculates whether it can and how it could invade Taiwan, because it's also looking at the economic cost to Russia, and frankly, Russia's economic resilience in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, to see what the cost would be for it to accomplish what is its decades old ambition, right? Which is to reclaim, in their view, Taiwan.
That was something that came up when I was at the Pentagon, and the hope, they said publicly, is that China has learned the lesson, taken the lesson,
Yeah.
that the world will aid in a response to an invasion. What is your sense in terms of how China, let's talk about China here, is viewing what happened in Ukraine and Russia? I know that you have laid out Xi Jinping now in his third term has become much more
Mm,
ambitious, that it's moved from a one-party state to really a one-man state in
yeah,
China, and that he's thrown out the year 2027, which is only 2.5 years from now, as a key year there.
it is. It is. That's the U.S. intel read. Has told his military to be ready at least by 2027 to invade Taiwan. It's interesting, and I talk about this in the book too. Here you have Putin and Xi. They are two different men, two different countries, different languages, different cultures, geographies, religions, histories, but have very similar ambitions and driving forces. They're nationalist leaders who see the world as it is today against them and against their interests. They see the U.S.-led international order as being fundamentally unfair to them, and they both see themselves as historical figures with a mission to right historical wrongs. For Putin, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he wants to bring that back to some degree, pull back some of these client states that went independent post 1991. To Xi, it's about righting a wrong from 150 some odd years before that, going back to the middle of the 19th century. When the West came into Asia, subjugated China, and took away its land and its influence, and then later with the nationalists going to Taiwan. Regardless, that Xi sees that as righting its own historical wrong, bringing Taiwan rightfully back into the Chinese fold, ignoring the fact that Taiwan is basically operating as an independent country. It's democratic. It's got a vibrant and open economy. And the Taiwanese people, I spent a lot of time there, have no interest in being absorbed by China. But both of them, they share a lot, Xi and Putin do. And Xi, to his point, he's president for life, just like Putin. And he has said repeatedly that he wants to right this wrong, and he believes he's the man to do it. And the wrong is Taiwan. And really the question is how he does it. And I talk about in the book how, there are folks who believe he might invade. There is a school of thought that he might try this boa constrictor strategy, which would be to envelop Taiwan and basically suffocate it, blockade it, and force it into submission. But we'll see.
Oh, without a bullet fired, basically an economic strategy.
Yeah, without a D-Day like invasion, right? Because even they might see, well, that's tough. Toughest thing to do is a amphibious landing. But to your question about how does China look at Russia's experience in Ukraine regarding its own potential experience in Taiwan. And I've heard the same thing from Blinken, the Defense Department, and others, is that they must look at Ukraine as a cautionary tale. Well, yes, up to now, right? But does it last, right? Does a new president come in and say, you know what, Russia, that's not really my battle? Does the West get exhausted by financial and military support for Ukraine? I mean, listen, it was only 2-3 months ago, wasn't clear the U.S. was going to continue its aid under a Democratic president, and a Democratic-led Senate. It wasn't clear. So I think the jury's out on what China's ultimate lesson is on Ukraine.
Yeah, one thing that struck me, I had former acting CIA director Mike Morrell on the pod last year, and he talked about some of the meetings that he had during his time with his Chinese counterparts, and they would talk at dinner parties about good millennia and bad millennia, good centuries and bad centuries, while we in the U.S. talk about good years, maybe good decades. Yeah. The Chinese view of history is one that is beyond our imagination here in the United States. And so as you talk about, Blinken and others, we've held strong in Ukraine for 2.5 years. For the Chinese, that's a drop in the bucket as far as their history is concerned.
Yeah, and if you look at let's just look at the last 100 years, right? And China, I would say this, with both China and Russia, all this is in their public statements and their speeches and their documents. Their ambitions are there, and it doesn't come out of nowhere. And Mark Milley says this in the book. He's like, listen to what they say, because they often act on what they say.
Wait, explain who Mark Milley is again?
Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under both Trump and Biden. And I interview him for the book. And Mark Milley says Trump will upend the U.S. relationship with the world. But he also made the point in relation to this that, we may view these threats of Putin and Xi as bluster, but he said in his experience, those folks tend to mean what they say. So we should listen to what they say about their ambitions. And if you look at China, going back close to 100 years, when the communists came into power, they set out and spoke out about what their goals were. It was first, solidify their position on the mainland, take Tibet. They took Tibet. Placate Xinjiang. They did that, and they're still doing that today. Hong Kong, right the mid-19th century wrong, right? Taiwan, right the mid-20th century wrong, and push out from the first island chain to the second island chain. They've been doing that before our eyes and following through on each of those. And it's so interesting. I took 2 years out of news a little over 10 years ago and served as chief of staff to the U.S. ambassador to China in Beijing. So spent 2 years in Beijing from 2011 to 2013. And when I was there then, the prevailing thinking in the diplomatic community about China was so different than what it is today. There were so many doubts about what China's ambitions were. And I remember when China had its first aircraft carrier, which they bought actually, oddly enough, from Ukraine. It was a Ukrainian aircraft carrier, which they then remodeled. What I would hear a lot in the embassy was China doesn't really want a big Navy. This is just an ego piece. They don't want real aircraft carriers. They're not going there. No interest in projecting power beyond the shallow waters off the coast of China. All BS, right? China is building its own aircraft carriers. It is extending its military power and influence elsewhere, Sri Lanka, Africa, South America, challenging on every front. that we had, it took a long time for the U.S. and the West to get out of this kind of antiquated view of where China stood on things. And again, despite what we saw before our eyes.
It's interesting. As you were saying that, I was just thinking that it kind of goes across the board, the doubting of ambition, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether it's, like the Israeli intel thinking, right? There's no way that they would do something like that. The Russian thinking on Ukraine, that ultimately a lot of these adversaries are much more ambitious than we give them credit for, or taking the sort of like post 9/11 term, there's a failure of imagination on the part of the Western military thinkers.
It's a great point. I mean, even think Jake Sullivan a couple months before October 7th. We don't have to worry about that part of the world right now.
Right. He had to revise his piece for foreign affairs because he said, the Middle East is very calm.
Yeah. It's, I do think we need a reset on how we look at the ambitions. In fact, we're beyond a reset on how we look at these ambitions of these powers. But I think we then have to reset just as citizens of the world, how we look at the effects on our lives and how we're going to adjust to it. It's interesting. You're younger than me, but when I was in college, I was in college when the Berlin Wall came down and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I remember, I grew up initially in the last Cold War when, this is how the world was divided between the Soviet Union and the U.S. And even in every movie, the bad guys were Russians, right? After 1991, there was this kind of like uncertain period in Hollywood. They're like, wait, who are the bad guys now? Let's try drug dealers. Let's try, Middle Eastern whatever.
Right, it went to the Middle East.
Went to the Middle East. Yeah. Now we're back. But, we had 30 years of this kind of post-Cold War era where it was no longer that kind of like standoff, but one reason I wrote this book is when I found myself in Ukraine in February 2022, as Russia is invading and starting the biggest war since World War II, that post-Cold War period, it was already fraying. It's gone. It's over. And we were back to really standing off in a number of spheres in kind of, in pretty open and aggressive conflict. And then you add into the mix new technologies, which give us entirely new fronts in that. Nuclear weapons still around, but there are more powers now, and China is rapidly growing. Cyber is new. The cyber front of this is new. The weaponization of space is new in this conflict, and that creates more areas where you can interact and conflict with each other, which then increases the dangers. It's that post Cold War period. It is done and dusted, and we got to operate in an entirely new space now, more dangerous.
Well, one thing I'll add to that, I mean, your book is very focused on sort of kinetic warfare in addition to cyber. The big story this year has been TikTok. And how the Chinese and the Russians are using technology, social media, in an information war, and being able to take advantage of our democracy, our open information system, to be able to manipulate sentiment here potentially, or worse. And that's something that I know comes up in the headlines a lot as you report on CNN. What's our sense of how they view that battle space?
Yeah. Well, so I wrote a book a few years ago called The Shadow War, which made the argument, the thesis was that Russia and China were already fighting a war below the level of kinetic conflict in these spaces, in cyberspace, outer space, and the disinformation space, with the intention of weakening the U.S. and the West without firing a shot, right? That's 5 years ago. The invasion of Ukraine showed us that they're willing to fire a shot too, but those spaces remain very active, and the disinformation space is one of them. TikTok. It's why does TikTok matter? Years ago, my friends in the Intel world told me, stay away from TikTok. Keep your kids away from TikTok. Don't put it in your phone. It's a massive Intel gathering thing, and that's in my household. That's like the one social media thing I've won the war, I've won the battle on. It's not in the household. But beyond gathering like personal information and so on, it is a really powerful disinformation tool. They have access to, 130 million U.S. users, where for a lot of them, that's how they get most of their news. It's a fantastic access point directly to Americans to skew their view of the world. In the 2016 election, when Russia interfered, TikTok wasn't as powerful, but they used social media to great effect.
They were using
and
Facebook.
that can change people's minds.
That was sort of peak Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. So now it's TikTok. And when folks talk about why this matters, I try to describe it to them in part in that way, that this is a easy, massive disinformation channel for one of our greatest adversaries. Do you want to leave that door wide open? And as you and I know, being in the news business, as the news business changes, more and more people get their news primarily via that means, not from, God knows, turning on the evening news broadcast or watching, 24-hour cable news.
I know it well, Jim. I spent 10 years at CBS.
Yes.
And that's significant. The comparison that I've seen made is that this is like allowing the Soviet Union to control NBC or ABC throughout the Cold
100%.
War, right?
100%.
Having an entire network. And while it's hard to see exact evidence, it's not explicit. Clearly, do you have a sense of what the Intel briefers told Capitol Hill that led to that overwhelming vote earlier this year? What was happening behind the scenes? What are the FBI and Intel folks gathering about exactly how China's using TikTok? Because they haven't really been very public about it.
Here are the three things I hear consistently. One, exactly what you said. It's a massive broadcast directly to American viewers led by America's number one adversary in China. Two, it's a massive intel gathering site. And listen, some of this we do in a million places, right? You give up so much information. You just sign the waiver. All is good about who you are, where you move, what you watch, how often you watch it, etc. So it's a great intel gathering thing.
Right. The phrase is, if the product is free, you're the product.
100%.
Yeah.
And then the added piece is it's also a great learning machine for AI, for China's AI. It helps them power their systems by drawing on us, how we speak, what we share, what we watch, how long we watch it, how we interact with it, etc. Those three things are the ones I hear most common about TikTok. And you think about the U.S. felt, and probably rightly so, that things like Radio Free Europe, that they had power and influence during the last Cold War, right? When you can sort of beam via shortwave, over the border into Eastern Europe and Russia and hopefully move some minds. But that was like a fractional tool compared to what TikTok does and how directly it goes to individuals and knows those individuals as it's kind of beaming straight into their smartphone.
Line you use early in the book struck me. Russia intends to bring the international order down. China looks to create an entirely new one. Explain that. Explain that to the average American, what that means.
It's a general view because folks will often say, okay, China and Russia, who's the bigger threat, right? Now, first of all, they are working together. They're not best friends and they have their differences, but they're working together, this no limits partnership, because they calculate it's in their shared interest to pool resources and power to help weaken the U.S. and either damage or remake this system. Now, they go about it somewhat differently, and the general view of Russia is that it's more of Bill Burns says this in the book, they'll bring the temple down, right? In biblical terms. They're willing to bring the temple down, cause chaos, profit from chaos where they can. And while China's willing to do it, China wants to re-engineer the system more in its favor, that it sees
China
the benefits.
China has a vision for 2.0, whereas Russia just wants to blow the whole thing up.
Exactly. Because China could see the benefits of it, to some degree, economic growth, etc. Russia often tends more into the rogue state kind of space. And it's not entirely, black and white in that sense, but that's generally the emphasis that I hear from Intel officials and others, both in Europe and in Asia. And then the other piece, folks will often ask, who's the bigger threat, right? And they're both threatening. Russia still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, bigger than ours, and they have tremendous ability to cause damage. But the China is seen as the greater long-term threat because it's it still has quite a formidable economy, whereas Russia's economy, for all its resilience in the face of the war and international sanctions, it's not. No one buys any Russian stuff, right, except oil. You and I don't buy Russia. Apple doesn't make its iPhones in Russia. We're not looking to buy Russian electric vehicles and air conditioners and tea, all that kind of stuff. It's a as John McCain said, it's a gas station masquerading as a state, but it's a nuclear armed gas station. So the general view is that China is the greater long term threat because it has more economic resilience and growth potential than Russia does, even though it's facing its own headwinds now.
One assumption, and I imagine it was the same when you were based in Beijing, is that China is so interconnected into the global system that disincentivizes them from actually invading a Taiwan, from creating total chaos, because they're so enmeshed in the global economy. And Ian Bremmer, who I think once described it as such, that the U.S. and China are two divorced parents trying to basically manage joint custody of the world, and that causing a global war is not in China's interest.
Yeah. So when I was in the embassy, a regular talking point at the time was Ambassador Gary Locke in his speeches was that the difference between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and the old Soviet Union was that the U.S. and China had, and I frankly forget the multiplier, but at least 1,000 times the trade that the U.S. had with the Soviet Union. And it's not just us buying stuff from them and them from us, but like we're making key stuff for us over there and them here and all that kind of stuff. So the U.S. and China still today have an order of magnitude greater trade than we had with the Soviet Union during the old Cold War. Now, the trouble is, and by the way, a lot of that still exists, and Apple's still making iPhones in China and so on. But it is separating somewhat slowly. I was in Beijing a little over 10 years ago. The vast majority of my Western friends who lived in China at the time have left, working for either joint ventures or even Chinese companies or U.S. companies in China, because those relationships are deteriorating, both the trade relationship and the business relationship at the micro level. In part, as well, it's because they're afraid to live there, right? They don't want to get on the wrong side of a legal dispute with China. They don't want to end up under house arrest. I mean, you've had these stories, and you have
even during COVID, the people stuck, the number of Westerners who were stuck in the camps China was putting people in.
Yes, that was not a pleasant experience too, and that was definitely a factor in a lot of folks leaving. Decoupling is not quite happening. I know the administration likes to use this word de-risking, but a separation is growing, and you have companies migrating their business and trade outside of China, and of course you have tariffs, U.S. imposing tariffs in one direction, China retaliating. You have two candidates running for election in this country kind of competing over each other as to who's going to put the higher tariffs on. You have these rules about chips that China can't buy, et cetera. So that relationship is separating, and more talk in China of being self-sufficient, which is, you understand the national security reasons for that. I get why the U.S. doesn't want to be selling chips to China that it uses in weapons that it might someday use against us, or uses in sends them to Russia for weapons in its war against Ukraine. But as I watch this just as a citizen of the world, when countries get further apart, conflict becomes more likely, and we don't necessarily want to be rooting for that, right? Because we want to be talking at a minimum. And you want to have shared interests too. And when you have fewer shared interests, that makes conflict more likely. And that's worrisome. I don't celebrate. I certainly don't celebrate that. I get the reasons for it, but I don't celebrate it.
Right. It's a tricky
personally.
Balance, right? Because of the way that China floods the market and impacts us economically.
Yep.
And
100%.
There's a variety of reasons you don't want to be too plugged in there. But then when you unplug completely, then China, has no qualms about conflict or doing things, because it's like, actually, we're self-sufficient economically. It's no big deal I mean, even look at Putin, right? It hasn't been great, but he's figured out a way to survive without connections to the West.
Yeah. I mean, listen, China has cheated for years, for decades, right? In terms of flooding the market, stealing U.S. technology, open handed, both from not just the national security level, but at the business level, creating these laws where if you had a joint venture in China, you had to give all your technology over, foreign technology transfer. And like, who would want to continue to play again? It's like you're playing a game of tennis and the other person just keeps lying about line calls, right? It's like, I don't want to play anymore with this person. But if you're not, then you worry about the other consequences of it. And those are real. You'd like to think that there were diplomatic solutions to this, right? But right now, the sad fact is that you have this, China and Russia certainly leaning on hard power, and the U.S. doing the same more and more.
Staying with China here for a second, you lay out war games that take place within U.S. institutions, looking at how a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would go. Yeah. How do they see that playing out right now? And most significantly, I know that we have this policy of strategic ambiguity, but what is the U.S. role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan and defense of Taiwan?
Okay, let's start with what that war would look like. It's ugly. I go into detail about the war games over specifically a Chinese D-Day like invasion of Taiwan. It would be unlike anything we've seen since World War II. And in terms of a handful of days, the casualties in a handful of days, it's hard to think of what the precursor would be, because the war games envision many tens of thousands of soldiers lost on both sides in the span of days. And if the U.S. were directly involved, we're talking about 2 aircraft carriers on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait, dozens of ships, destroyers and support ships, hundreds of aircraft, and the sailors and airmen and airwomen and service members who go with them. So,
would the U.S. be a target in that preemptive Chinese strike?
It's the U.S. view that it would be, even if the U.S. weren't necessarily a frontline force, because China would reasonably calculate that to make a credible attempt at taking Taiwan, it would have to take out U.S. capabilities first, including, air base in Guam and elsewhere, to take out a strike capability, counterstrike capability. So that's worrisome, and it's, any discussion of U.S. military involvement has to involve a sober understanding of what the costs would be. And, it's interesting. I talked in the book to General John Kelly about a lot of things, including Trump, but also this. And by the way, there's a long segment in the book about how Trump repeatedly praised Hitler, which John Kelly on the record describes to me. You may want to read that if you want to understand exactly how he talks and who he admires. But separate from that for a moment, Kelly makes the point that, U.S. leaders, as they talk about defending Taiwan, have not adequately described to the American people what that would mean for the U.S. And have they sold that to the American people, understanding those potential costs? And no one's more credible than John Kelly to raise that question, because here is a man who's commanded forces for the U.S. in war and is a Gold Star father. He lost his son, stepped on a mine in Afghanistan. So he's aware of those costs and encourages the American people and American leaders to be conscious of that. So to the point about strategic ambiguity, President Biden has effectively eliminated that as U.S. policy, because 4 times as president, he has said the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily. He hasn't defined that defense, but he has committed the U.S., at least while he's president, to defending Taiwan militarily. And that presents at least the possibility of direct conflict between the U.S. and China, with the possibility of enormous consequences. Now, here's something else about this election. We talk about how many things are on the ballot. Trump, according to several of the senior advisors, they find it very unlikely that he would defend Taiwan militarily. In fact, John Bolton tells the story of how Trump, when he was in the Oval as president, would pick up a Sharpie, and he likes Sharpies, and he would point to the tip of the Sharpie and say, "See that? That's Taiwan. See this desk, the Resolute desk? That's China," to make the point that Taiwan, the U.S. has no business or interest in attempting to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. Just not practical in his view.
So make the counter for me. I mean, there's a lot of Americans, and I hear it, are like, listen, at the end of the day, so what? Putin takes Ukraine. So what? China takes Taiwan. What does that mean to me here? We have bridges collapsing here in this country. We have infrastructure issues. We have a lot of problems here in America. The resources that we commit abroad in defense of these nations, I understand their democracies, etc., it is a lot. What happens the day after China takes Taiwan, or the day after Putin gets all of Ukraine?
Well, the question is, do you want to live in a world where not one but two powers, and maybe more, Iran and North Korea, work very closely with Russia and China, where you can change borders of sovereign states, including sovereign states that are democracies and our allies, by force alone? Putin is attempting that in Ukraine and has had some success. And by the way, before 2022, he sliced off two pieces of Ukraine in 2014. He sliced off a piece of Georgia. And as you know, if you talk to many folks in Eastern Europe, they believe they might be his next targets. China created land in the South China Sea, areas claimed by half a dozen nations, without firing a shot, but by force. It has enveloped Hong Kong, that was not independent, but had its own system, and now has its designs on Taiwan. Do you want to live in a world where you could roll tanks across a border and redraw the borders of Europe or Asia or elsewhere, or the Korean Peninsula, right? We've been tested like this before in the 20th century. And we saw what the consequences were of just assuming they would stop, right? Give Hitler the Sudetenland and all will be fine. Well, it wasn't enough for him, and he went on. And we lived with the consequences of that on a bunch of different levels. The bloodiest war, but also the Holocaust and other costs of that. We've lived in that world before. Do we want to live in that world again? And do we want to assume that the Putins and Xis will stop if you give them just one more slice? What is a slice? When do those slices become satisfying? I mean, Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia, who I speak to extensively in this book, she likes to quote Churchill on the crocodile. The appeaser is the one who feeds the crocodile, expecting to be its last meal. And we could look back to the history of World War II as a cautionary tale, but we don't even have to look back that far, because Putin in more recent history has already shown us what he does when he feels that he can keep pushing the limits. 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, 2022 in Ukraine, Moldova, Transnistria, you name it, maybe the Baltics.
After writing this and speaking with everyone that you've spoken to, and talking about the great risks that are in store that we're dealing with today, Jim, do you come away an optimist or a pessimist? What's your feeling after writing this?
I come away a realist, that if we don't acknowledge the truth of this world we're living in and stand up to it, we will pay for it. And we can't imagine we can live in this world in a passive way. I am not an advocate for war. I often make the point when talking about the book that I've got two boys that are like a minute away from draft age. When I read the Taiwan war game scenarios, I don't want my sons involved in that, just like I don't want yours or our friends' sons, right? I don't want them to pay the ultimate price. So I'm not a warmonger by any means. I've spent a lot of my career in Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Middle East, seeing the consequences of war face up. So I don't want that. But I also have the strong sense from reporting out this book and writing previous books and just in my day job, that if we don't acknowledge the ambitions of the Putins and Xis of the world and the Kims and the Iranians and stand up to it, that we will tempt danger, and that appeasement historically doesn't work. It didn't work in the 20th century. It hasn't worked in the 21st century. And we have to find a better way. Peace through strength sounds like a bumper sticker, but there is precedent for showing resolve and heading off some of the worst outcomes. So I'd say realist.
Realist, and when you talk about peace through strength, you're talking about deterrence, like the U.S. has to keep up its defenses, but it also sounds like uh, building some semblance of a relationship with these countries to the extent possible is also
Yep.
also important here.
Absolutely. Bill Burns talks about it too. He talks about, the CIA director, importance of communication, importance of, and sometimes direct and difficult communication. What are your red lines? I talk in the book about the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how a lot of the things like the hotline, right, between Moscow and Washington, and even the beginnings of nuclear arms reduction talks flew out of the Cuban Missile Crisis because both sides realized how close they came to a nuclear conflict, and both sides didn't want it and said, we got to find a way forward. It wasn't perfect, and there were close calls that followed, but never as close as that. And I think we should be prescient and think in similar terms. That doesn't mean yielding. It doesn't mean assuming that you can change your adversary, because from their point of view, these are strategic interests, but it does mean that you can find ways to navigate this with both prudence, but also strength.
We'll leave it there. Jim Sciutto, thank you, man.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.